It was just past midnight on July 6, 1932. The summer air hung thick and humid over the rolling hills of North Carolina, heavy with the drone of cicadas that had emerged by the millions that season. Inside the sprawling white mansion known as Ralda House, a party was winding down. Crystal glasses sat half-empty on mahogany tables. The last guests had driven off into the darkness, their headlights disappearing down the long tree-lined drive. And somewhere on the second floor, in a screened sleeping porch overlooking gardens that stretched toward a moonlit lake, a single gunshot cracked through the night. The sound was muffled, almost lost beneath the relentless chorus of insects. A night watchman patrolling the grounds heard what he thought might have been a pop, nothing more. He paused beneath an oak tree and listened for 3 long minutes. No screams, no cries for help. Just the cicadas and the soft rustle of wind through magnolia leaves. He moved on, unaware that in those moments, one of America's wealthiest young heirs lay bleeding on a porch floor, a bullet lodged in his brain. His name was Zachary Smith Reynolds. He was 20 years old. He was heir to a tobacco fortune worth the equivalent of nearly $500 million today. And by sunrise, he would be dead. The woman found kneeling beside him was his wife of just 7 months, a glamorous Broadway torch singer named Libby Holman. She claimed she remembered nothing, that the alcohol had erased everything. The only other person in that wing of the house was Smith's childhood friend and personal secretary, a young man named Albert Walker. Their stories did not match. They would never match. And to this day, nearly a century later, no one knows for certain what happened in that mansion on that summer night. Was it murder? Was it suicide? Was it a tragic accident fueled by jealousy, alcohol, and the unbearable weight of inherited wealth? The answers may still linger within the walls of Ralda House, a place built for dreams but destined to witness nightmares. To understand what happened that night, we must go back to the beginning, to the man who built this fortune and the woman who built this house, and to a family whose story reads like a Southern Gothic novel written in tobacco leaves and blood. The story begins not with a mansion, but with a young man and a covered wagon. In 1874, Richard Joshua Reynolds left his family's tobacco farm in Patrick County, Virginia, with $7,500 in his pocket and a dream burning in his chest. He was 24 years old, tall and solidly built, with a stammer that made some men underestimate him, and eyes that revealed an intelligence those same men would come to regret dismissing. Richard, known to everyone as R.J., had grown up surrounded by tobacco. His father, Hardin Reynolds, owned a prosperous plantation worked by enslaved people before the Civil War, and afterward, the family continued farming and manufacturing chewing tobacco. But R.J. wanted more than the quiet life of a Virginia planter. He wanted to build an empire. He chose Winston, North Carolina, as his destination, a small town of just 400 souls nestled in the Piedmont region, where the rolling hills gave way to the mountains. What attracted him was simple but visionary. Winston sat at the junction of newly built railroad lines, a crucial advantage in an era when transportation determined commercial success. More importantly, the town was surrounded by some of the finest tobacco-growing land in the world. The bright leaf tobacco of North Carolina, with its distinctive golden color and remarkably mild flavor, was fast becoming the most sought-after tobacco in America. The soil, the climate, the very air of the Piedmont seemed designed by nature itself to produce the perfect leaf. R.J. saw opportunity where others saw only red clay and rolling hills, endless possibility where others saw merely farms and forest. With his modest capital, he purchased a small lot next to the railroad tracks and built what he affectionately called his little red factory. It was hardly impressive, smaller than a tennis court, with a handful of workers producing flat-plug chewing tobacco. But from the very first year, when they produced 150,000 pounds of tobacco, R.J. Reynolds demonstrated the business acumen that would make him one of the richest men in America. He experimented constantly, adding saccharin to sweeten his tobacco and make it last longer than competitors' products. He advertised aggressively across the eastern states. He treated his workers well, offering wages and conditions that attracted the best laborers, both white and black, to his factories. And most importantly, he understood something that many businessmen of his era did not. He understood that the future of tobacco lay not in chewing, but in smoking. By the 1890s, R.J. Reynolds had become one of the dominant tobacco manufacturers in the South. His company had grown so successful that it caught the attention of James Buchanan Duke, the ruthless monopolist whose American Tobacco Company was swallowing every competitor in sight. In 1899, Duke absorbed Reynolds into his trust, but R.J. negotiated terms that allowed him to maintain operational independence. He was forbidden from manufacturing cigarettes, a restriction that gnawed at him constantly. But he bided his time, continuing to grow his business and waiting for the day when the trust would fall. That day came in 1911, when the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of the American Tobacco Company. R.J. Reynolds was finally free, and almost immediately, he launched his greatest gamble. In 1913, Reynolds introduced a new product that would revolutionize the tobacco industry. He called it Camel cigarettes. The name came from a circus that was passing through Winston-Salem, where a dromedary named Old Joe caught his fancy. The cigarette itself was a masterpiece of blending, combining bright leaf tobacco with Turkish leaf for aroma and burley for body. Reynolds priced it below his competitors and advertised it relentlessly. Within a year, he had sold 425 million packs. Within 4 years, Camel was the most popular cigarette in America. By 1918, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company employed 10,000 workers in 121 buildings across Winston-Salem. The town had grown 90-fold since R.J.'s arrival, becoming the largest city in North Carolina. And Richard Joshua Reynolds had become by far the wealthiest man in the state. His annual tax payment of $66,000 was double that of the next highest taxpayer. But for all his success, R.J. Reynolds remained a bachelor well into middle age. He was married to his work, spending long days in his factories, personally overseeing production, knowing his workers by name. Some said he was too focused on business for romance. Others whispered that he was simply waiting for the right woman. He found her in his own office. Catherine Smith was everything R.J. was not. Where he was practical and methodical, she was imaginative and visionary. Where he stammered through conversations, she spoke with eloquence and passion. She was born in 1880 in Mount Airy, North Carolina, to a prosperous local businessman. Her father owned farms and business interests. Her mother traded in real estate and stocks, unusual for a woman of that era. Catherine grew up in a household where women were expected to think for themselves. She attended the State Normal and Industrial School in Greensboro, an institution founded to educate women for careers beyond the home. A typhoid epidemic forced her to transfer to Sullins College in Virginia, where she graduated in 1902. She then returned to Mount Airy to teach China painting before taking a position as a secretary at the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. It was there, in the offices of the richest man in North Carolina, that she caught the eye of her employer. They were cousins, distantly related through tangled Southern family trees. They were also separated by 30 years, RJ being 54 and Catherine just 25 when they married on February 27, 1905. Some in Winston-Salem society whispered about the age difference. Others speculated about her motives. But those who knew them understood that this was, despite all appearances, a genuine love match. RJ joked that he had married Catherine to get back the $1,000 she had won in a company contest. It was his way, dry humor masking deep affection. For her part, Catherine brought a vitality and purpose to his life that he had never known. She was, as one family member later described her, the first feminist he had ever heard of, a woman with opinions who was not afraid to express them. After a lavish 4-month honeymoon across Europe, where Catherine fell in love with the grand estates and formal gardens of England and France, the couple returned to Winston-Salem and moved into RJ's Queen Anne-style mansion on 5th Street. But Catherine had bigger dreams. She wanted to build something that would embody everything she believed in. A place where her family could live in health and harmony, surrounded by nature, supported by modern technology, and grounded in progressive ideals. In 1906, Catherine began purchasing land on the outskirts of Winston-Salem, much of it in her own name, a rare legal act for married women of that era. Over the next several years, she assembled more than 1,000 acres of rolling countryside, forests, and farmland. She called the property Reynolda, a name combining her husband's surname with the romantic suffix that evoked estates of the English countryside. But Reynolda would be no imitation of European aristocracy. Catherine envisioned something uniquely American, a model community that would demonstrate how modern science and progressive thinking could create a healthier, more fulfilling way of life. She wanted a working farm that would serve as an experiment station for local farmers, teaching them the latest techniques in crop rotation, soil analysis, and animal husbandry. She wanted schools and churches for her workers. She wanted gardens that bloomed year-round and orchards that provided fresh fruit. And at the center of it all, she wanted a home where her children could grow up surrounded by fresh air, sunshine, and space to run and play. Construction began in 1912 under the direction of Philadelphia architect Charles Barton Keene. Catherine worked closely with Keene on every detail, insisting on designs that prioritized health and comfort over mere grandeur. The main house would be built in the style of an American country house, a sprawling bungalow with white stucco walls and a distinctive green clay tile roof. It would blend colonial revival elegance with arts and crafts practicality, featuring low-slung roofs, broad porches, and seamless connections between indoor and outdoor spaces. While construction proceeded, RJ and Catherine had 4 children in rapid succession. Richard Joshua Jr., called Dick, was born in 1906. Mary followed in 1908, Nancy in 1910, and finally, on November 5, 1911, the youngest child arrived. They named him Zachary Smith Reynolds, after Catherine's father. He would come to be known simply as Smith. From the beginning, Smith was different from his siblings. Where Dick was serious and driven, Smith was dreamy and sensitive. Where Mary and Nancy were content with the structured life of wealthy Southern children, Smith seemed always to be looking toward the horizon, searching for something beyond the boundaries of his privileged world. His father, R.J., doted on him despite being old enough to be his grandfather. The tobacco baron would sit in his camp chair during family outings at Reynolda, stroking his beard while young Smith played at his feet. But the golden years of the Reynolds family were numbered. In 1917, the same year the grand house at Reynolda was finally completed, RJ fell gravely ill. What doctors eventually diagnosed as pancreatic cancer had been slowly consuming him. He spent most of that year in hospitals, often far from home, fighting a battle he could not win. The family moved into Ralda House just in time for Christmas of 1917. The mansion was magnificent. 64 rooms spread across more than 34,000 square feet of carefully designed living space. It stood as a testament to Catherine's vision, its white stucco walls gleaming against the green Carolina landscape, its clay tile roof echoing the colors of the surrounding forest. Every bedroom had its own bathroom, a remarkable luxury for that era, chosen not for extravagance but for hygiene. One of Catherine's obsessions. She had studied the latest research on germs and disease, and she was determined that her family would live in the healthiest environment possible. A central vacuuming system eliminated dust, those invisible carriers of illness. An aeolian pipe organ filled the house with music, its pipes hidden within the walls so that melodies seemed to emerge from the very structure itself. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel counters, revolutionary for a domestic setting, easier to clean and sanitize than any wooden surface, and screened sleeping porches extended from the bedrooms, allowing the family to sleep in fresh air year-round, breathing in the scent of pine and magnolia rather than the stale air of enclosed rooms. Outside, the estate sprawled across more than 1,000 acres. A model dairy farm provided fresh milk from Jersey cattle, processed under the strictest sanitary conditions. Greenhouses supplied vegetables and flowers throughout the year. A 9-hole golf course wound through the property. A man-made lake named Lake Catherine shimmered in the valley below the house. Workers lived in a village complete with its own church, school, and post office. It was everything Catherine had dreamed of during those long years of planning. But RJ had only months to enjoy it. On July 29, 1918, just 7 months after moving into Ralda, Richard Joshua Reynolds died. He was 68 years old, the man who had built a tobacco empire from a little red factory, who had transformed a sleepy southern town into the largest city in North Carolina, who had introduced America to Camel cigarettes, was gone. He left behind a fortune estimated at the modern equivalent of over $1 billion and 4 children, the oldest just 12, the youngest not yet 7. Smith Reynolds was 6 years old when his father died. He would later have only the haziest memories of the man, fragments of camping trips and quiet moments in the library. What he inherited instead was a legacy, a name that carried immense weight, and a fortune so vast it would shape every aspect of his short life. Catherine threw herself into running Ralda and continuing her philanthropic work. She established hot lunch programs and nurseries for female workers at the tobacco factories. She helped found an integrated YWCA in Winston-Salem. She donated land and funds for a new public high school, which would be named R.J. Reynolds High School, in memory of her husband. She was determined that her children would grow up understanding that wealth carried responsibility, that privilege demanded service. But Catherine's own time was also running short. In 1921, she remarried, wedding J. Edward Johnston, the young superintendent of the Ralda School and a World War I veteran many years her junior. The children, particularly Dick, resented their new stepfather. Young Mary wrote in her diary after the secret ceremony that they were trying to keep it quiet, but the whole town knew. In 1924, at the age of 43, Catherine became pregnant again. It was a risky pregnancy given her age and declining health. She traveled to New York to be near better doctors, leaving Ralda and her children behind. On May 20th, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, J. Edward Johnston, Jr. 3 days later, on May 23, 1924, a pulmonary embolism stopped her heart. Smith Reynolds was 12 years old when his mother died. In the span of 6 years, he had lost both parents. He and his siblings were now orphans, fabulously wealthy orphans, whose fortune would not fully come into their control until they turned 28. Their uncle, William Neal Reynolds, R.J.'s younger brother, who had helped build the tobacco company, became their guardian. He and his wife Kate, who had no children of their own, did their best to provide stability. They appointed a cousin-in-law, Robert Lassiter, and his wife to oversee the children's daily care at Reynolda. But the damage was done. The Reynolds children had lost the two people who might have anchored them, who might have taught them how to carry the burden of their name and use their fortune for good, rather than letting it consume them. Instead, they grew up in the shadow of Ralda House, surrounded by servants and tutors who could never replace the parents they had lost. They had more money than they could ever spend, more freedom than any children should possess, and no parents to guide them through the treacherous waters of wealth and privilege. The trustees managed their finances with care, doling out allowances and monitoring investments. But money management was not the same as love. The great house that Catherine had built as a sanctuary for healthy family living had become, through tragic circumstance, something closer to a gilded prison. Smith, the youngest and most sensitive of the children, seemed to struggle the most. He was an indifferent student, more interested in daydreaming than in books, his mind always drifting toward distant horizons. He was shy around strangers, uncomfortable with the attention his famous name attracted wherever he went. While his siblings found ways to cope, Smith seemed to carry the loss of his parents more heavily, as though the grief had settled into his bones and refused to leave. He grew moody and introspective, given to dark thoughts that worried those who knew him best. But he found one passion that gave his restless spirit purpose, one love that made him feel truly alive, a passion that would carry him around the world, and some would say, lead him inexorably toward his death. Smith Reynolds fell in love with airplanes. It was the golden age of aviation, the era of Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, when pilots were heroes and the sky was the last frontier. The world was captivated by these daring men and women who climbed into fragile machines of wood, fabric, and wire and hurled themselves into the heavens. Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927, transforming himself overnight from an unknown airmail pilot into the most famous person on Earth. Earhart and other aviatrices were proving that women could fly just as boldly as men. Aviation clubs sprang up across America, and wealthy young men competed to set records, to fly faster, farther, higher than anyone had before. Smith's older brother Dick had caught the flying bug first, purchasing the historic Roosevelt Field on Long Island, the same field from which Lindbergh had departed for Paris, and founding Reynolds Aviation. Dick was the businessman of the family, always looking for investments and opportunities, but Smith's passion for flying burned with a purer flame. To him, the airplane was not a business venture. It was freedom. It was escape. It was the one place where his name did not matter, where the weight of his inheritance fell away and he was simply a pilot, alone with the wind and the clouds and the endless blue above. He dropped out of school at 15 to work for his brother and learn everything he could about flying. He studied mechanics so he could understand every bolt and wire in his aircraft. He practiced takeoffs and landings until his instructors marveled at his natural skill. He listened to experienced pilots and absorbed their wisdom like a sponge. By 1929, at just 17 years old, Smith Reynolds had earned both his transport pilot's license and his mechanic's license, making him the youngest person in America to hold both credentials. He became a local hero in Winston-Salem, barnstorming through the Carolina countryside with his sister Mary, putting on shows in farmers' fields they had mowed into makeshift runways. He raced planes at the dedication of Winston-Salem's new airport, and won. He spent every spare moment in the air, escaping the weight of his name, the emptiness of Ralda House, the loneliness that seemed to follow him everywhere. In 1929, seeking perhaps to fill another void, Smith married for the first time. His bride was Anne Cannon, daughter of the towel manufacturing magnate whose name was as prominent in North Carolina textiles as Reynolds was in tobacco. Smith was barely 18. The wedding took place at 2 a.m. in York, South Carolina, with only the bride's father, a judge, and a policeman in attendance. It was impulsive, reckless, and doomed from the start. Within 2 years, Smith would fly Anne to Reno for a divorce, moving on as quickly as he had moved in. By 1930, Smith Reynolds had everything a young man could want. He had wealth beyond imagining. He had fame as one of America's most daring young aviators. He had the freedom to go anywhere and do anything. And yet, by all accounts, he was profoundly unhappy. Friends described him as moody and brooding. He spoke of feeling alone all his life, of never having known real love. He carried a pistol everywhere, paranoid about kidnapping in an era when wealthy heirs were targets for ransom. More than once he put that pistol to his own head, threatening to end it all. And then, in April of 1930, at a performance of The Little Show in Baltimore, Smith Reynolds saw a woman on stage who would change everything. She was dark-haired and sultry, with a voice that seemed to reach into the soul. She sang a song called Moanin' Low, and by the time she finished, Smith was captivated. Her name was Libby Holman, and she was about to become the most controversial woman in America. Libby Holman was born Elizabeth Lloyd Holzman in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1904, the daughter of a Jewish stockbroker. From childhood, she burned with ambition, determined to escape the ordinary life that awaited most women of her generation. She studied at the University of Cincinnati and then headed to New York, where the bright lights of Broadway beckoned with promises of fame and fortune. She was not conventionally beautiful, but she possessed something more powerful than beauty. She had presence. Her dark hair, her smoldering eyes, her voice that could drop to a whisper or rise to a wail, all combined to create an effect that audiences found mesmerizing. She played small roles at first, working her way up through the chorus lines and revues that populated the theater district. But in 1929, she got her breakthrough. The Little Show was a sophisticated revue that showcased the talents of emerging performers, the kind of smart, urbane entertainment that New York audiences craved in the final years before the Depression changed everything. Libby's number, Moanin' Low, became the sensation of the season. Night after night, she stood alone in a single spotlight, her body swaying almost imperceptibly, her voice dripping with longing and despair as she sang of a woman hopelessly trapped by her love for a dangerous man. The song built slowly, each verse adding new layers of heartbreak, until the final notes hung in the air like a confession. Critics raved about her raw emotional power. Audiences swooned and wept, and Libby Holman became, almost overnight, the toast of Broadway. She was also, by the standards of her time, scandalous. She drank heavily in an era of prohibition. She attended wild parties with artists and intellectuals. She was openly bisexual, conducting affairs with both men and women, most notably with Louisa Dondelot Carpenter, an heiress to the DuPont fortune. She wore mannish clothes and said whatever she thought, regardless of who might be offended. She was, in short, everything that proper society found threatening, and everything that young rebels found irresistible. When Smith Reynolds saw her perform in Baltimore in April of 1930, he was instantly captivated. He was 19 years old, recently divorced, lonely despite his wealth, searching for something or someone to fill the emptiness inside him. Libby was 26, worldly and sophisticated, at the height of her fame. To his friends, the attraction seemed inexplicable. What could this glamorous Broadway star possibly see in a shy, stammering boy from North Carolina? To Libby's friends, the attraction was all too clear. Smith Reynolds was one of the richest young men in America. Smith pursued her with the single-minded intensity that characterized everything he did. He sent flowers to her dressing room. He followed her from city to city as she toured with the show. He flew his airplane over the house where she was staying, dropping rose petals along the path to the beach. He wrote her letters filled with declarations of love. He begged her to marry him, even though he was technically still married to Anne Cannon. Libby was amused by this earnest young suitor, this puppy who followed her everywhere. Her friends found him annoying, calling him her personal mascot, Smitty the traveling bear. They tolerated him because he paid for everything: the nightclubs, the speakeasies, the parties that lasted until dawn. But they did not take him seriously. He was too young, too naive, too desperate for love. And yet, something about Smith touched Libby. Perhaps she saw beneath his awkward exterior to the wounded soul that matched her own. Perhaps she recognized in him a fellow outsider, someone who never quite fit in despite all their advantages. Or perhaps, as some would later suggest, she simply saw an opportunity too good to pass up. Smith told her he had been alone all his life, that he had never known real love. He told her that if she refused to marry him, he would kill himself. It was emotional blackmail, the manipulation of a troubled young man, but it worked. In the summer of 1930, Libby finally agreed to wait for him, to consider marriage once his divorce was final. That divorce came through in November of 1931. 6 days later, on November 29th, Smith and Libby were married in the parlor of a justice of the peace in Monroe, Michigan. There was no fanfare, no society wedding, no announcement in the newspapers. They kept the marriage secret for months, even as Smith embarked on the adventure that would cement his reputation as one of America's most daring young aviators. In the spring of 1931, while still courting Libby, Smith had purchased a Savoia Marchetti amphibian biplane and begun planning an around-the-world flight. The aircraft was specially modified with a single seat and extra fuel tanks, capable of flying 1,000 miles without refueling. Smith studied maps and weather patterns, consulted with experienced pilots, and plotted a route that would take him from London across Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, India, and finally to Hong Kong. It would be the longest point-to-point solo circumnavigation ever attempted. He departed London in December of 1931, just days after his secret wedding to Libby. While she continued touring with her show, Smith flew alone across some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. He crossed the Syrian desert, where a mechanical failure could mean death. He navigated the mountain passes of India, where weather could change in an instant. He pushed his little plane through 17,000 miles of adventure, breaking records and proving himself a pilot of extraordinary skill and courage. The journey ended in Hong Kong in April of 1932, where Libby joined him for a belated honeymoon. They were photographed together on the streets of the exotic city, the glamorous Broadway star and the boyish aviator, looking for all the world like a couple in love. But the final leg of Smith's journey had been troubled. Flying over China, his engine had nearly failed, forcing him to throw supplies overboard to stay aloft. He had to abandon the plane in Chanqiang and complete the trip to Hong Kong by ship. The triumphant conclusion he had envisioned never materialized. Something else had gone wrong as well, something that would fester in the months to come. Smith had planned to publish an account of his journey, to share his adventure with the world. But after reaching Hong Kong, he abruptly canceled those plans. He abandoned his flight log and withdrew from public attention. Some historians believe he was disappointed by the compromised ending of his flight. Others suggest that the long months of solitude had darkened his already troubled mind. Whatever the reason, the Smith Reynolds who returned to America in the spring of 1932 was not the same hopeful young man who had departed. The couple settled at Reynolds for the summer. Libby, who had given up her Broadway career to become Mrs. Smith Reynolds, now found herself presiding over one of the grandest estates in the South. She tried to embrace her new role, hosting parties and entertaining guests from Winston-Salem society, but she was a fish out of water, a New York sophisticate trapped in a world of Southern gentility and tobacco money. She drank to cope with the boredom and the isolation. Smith drank too, despite his young age. The arguments began. Friends and servants noticed the tension between them. Smith was jealous and possessive, terrified that Libby would leave him, that she had only married him for his money. Libby was frustrated by his mood swings, his paranoia, his constant need for reassurance. They quarreled about his canceled around-the-world trip, about her past relationships, about everything and nothing. Sometimes Smith would storm out of the house, only to return hours later, tearful and apologetic. Sometimes he would put his pistol to his head and threaten to end it all. In the midst of this turmoil, Libby discovered she was pregnant. It should have been happy news, the promise of a family, a reason for hope, but the pregnancy only seemed to increase the pressure on their fragile marriage. Smith oscillated between joy at the prospect of fatherhood and despair at his inability to make Libby happy. He enrolled in New York University's aeronautical engineering program for the fall, hired a tutor to help him catch up on mathematics, and made plans for the future. But the darkness kept closing in. On the evening of July 5, 1932, Smith and Libby hosted a party at Ralda House. The occasion was the 21st birthday of Charles Gideon Hill, known as Charlie, a childhood friend of Smith's. Guests arrived from some of Winston-Salem's finest families. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of elegant summer gathering that Catherine Reynolds had once presided over in those same rooms. But something was wrong from the start. Libby was drinking heavily, engaged in what witnesses described as a drinking contest with another guest. She seemed tense and agitated, her gaiety forced. At some point during the evening, she disappeared for nearly 3 hours. No one knew where she had gone or what she had been doing. When she reappeared, the party was winding down. By 11 o'clock, most of the guests had left. Only a handful remained in the great house, its rooms now quiet after the evening's festivities. Smith's childhood friend and secretary, Albert Walker, known as Ab, had stayed behind. So had the actress Blanche Yerka, a houseguest of Libby's from New York. The servants had retired to their quarters. The night watchman began his rounds outside. What happened next would become the subject of investigations, inquests, and speculation for nearly a century. According to Ab Walker's testimony, Smith came downstairs around midnight. He was agitated, upset about something. He told Walker that their planned around-the-world trip was canceled, that he was going to end it all tonight. He threw his wallet at Walker, saying he could have it. Then he went back upstairs, where Libby was waiting in their bedroom. Walker heard them arguing. The voices rose and fell, the words indistinct. Then, sometime after midnight, he heard a sound, a muffled pop. A moment later, Libby appeared on the balcony overlooking the grand hall. She was screaming. "Smith has shot himself," she cried. "Come quickly." Walker raced upstairs. He found Smith lying on the sleeping porch adjacent to their bedroom, blood pooling beneath his head. A Mauser semi-automatic pistol lay nearby. Smith was unconscious but still breathing, the bullet having entered his right temple. With Libby's help, Walker carried Smith down to a car and rushed him to North Carolina Baptist Hospital. At 5:25 in the morning on July 6, 1932, Zachary Smith Reynolds was pronounced dead. He was 20 years old. He left behind a pregnant widow, a fortune of $20 million, and a mystery that would never be solved. The investigation that followed was chaotic from the start, a collision of wealth, power, and small-town law enforcement that would doom any hope of finding the truth. The crime scene, if it was a crime scene, had been hopelessly compromised. Smith's body had been moved before police arrived, carried down the stairs, and driven to the hospital in a desperate attempt to save his life. The pistol had been handled by multiple people, any fingerprints smudged or obliterated. The sleeping porch where Smith had fallen had been walked through by servants, family members, and friends before anyone thought to preserve it as evidence. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of what they had seen and heard that night. Times did not match. Details shifted from one telling to the next, and Libby Holman, the only person who had been with Smith when the gun went off, claimed she remembered nothing at all. She told investigators that she had been drinking heavily all evening, that the alcohol had erased her memory of those crucial hours. She could not say whether Smith had shot himself or whether someone else had pulled the trigger. She could not explain the argument that Walker had overheard. She could not account for the 3 hours she had disappeared during the party. Her amnesia was convenient, perhaps too convenient. The coroner initially ruled the death a suicide. Smith had a history of threatening to kill himself. He had been heard saying he would end it all that very night. The pistol was his own, one he carried constantly out of fear of kidnapping. It seemed like an open and shut case, another troubled rich boy who could not handle the pressure of his inheritance. But troubling details emerged. The night watchman, William Fulcher, had heard the shot and gone to investigate. He stood beneath the window of Smith and Libby's bedroom for 3 full minutes, listening. He heard no screams, no cries for help, nothing to suggest the panic one would expect if a woman had just witnessed her husband shoot himself. Only later, after some time had passed, did Libby appear on the balcony. There were whispers about Libby and Ab Walker. Some witnesses claimed they had seen them in compromising positions, that they were having an affair. A nurse at the hospital reported finding them grappling on the floor in what she described as a romantic embrace, even as Smith lay dying in the next room. Was it possible that the two of them had conspired to murder Smith for his money? The Reynolds family insisted publicly that Smith had committed suicide. They wanted the scandal to go away, the newspapers to stop printing headlines, the curiosity seekers to leave them in peace. But the authorities were not satisfied. In August of 1932, a grand jury was convened to investigate the death. On August 4th, the grand jury handed down its verdict. It was not suicide. Zachary Smith Reynolds had been murdered, and the grand jury indicted 2 people for first-degree murder, Libby Holman Reynolds and Albert Bailey Walker. The charge carried the death penalty. If convicted, both could be executed in North Carolina's electric chair. Libby disappeared. With the help of her wealthy friend Louisa Carpenter, She went into hiding on one of the DuPont heiress's estates in the Chesapeake Bay area. Police in 4 states searched for her, but she remained beyond their reach. Meanwhile, her father made an announcement that changed everything. Libby Holman Reynolds was pregnant with the heir to the Reynolds Tobacco fortune. The news electrified the nation. The possibility that Smith's child might be born in prison, that the grandchild of R.J. Reynolds might enter the world under the shadow of a murder indictment, was unthinkable. The Reynolds family, which had been quietly pushing for a quick resolution, now moved decisively to end the case. In December of 1932, the charges against Libby and Ab Walker were dropped. The official explanation was insufficient evidence, but everyone in North Carolina understood what had really happened. The Reynolds family had made a phone call to the state solicitor. The tobacco money had spoken. The case would never go to trial. Libby emerged from hiding and gave birth to Christopher Smith Reynolds, known as Topper, in January of 1933. The baby was premature, weighing just 3.5 pounds, but he survived. He was the sole heir to his father's $20 million fortune, a fortune that Libby would control as his guardian until he came of age. She never returned to Reynolda, the mansion where her husband had died, where she had spent those tumultuous months as a tobacco heiress, held too many memories. She took her son and left North Carolina forever, returning to the world of theater and New York society that she had known before. But the shadow of Smith's death followed her for the rest of her life. The newspapers never stopped speculating. The questions never stopped coming. Did she kill her husband? Did Ab Walker? Was it really suicide after all? Libby maintained her story of amnesia until her death in 1971, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. Tragedy continued to stalk those connected to that night. Ab Walker left Winston-Salem after the acquittal and disappeared from public view for 21 years. He died in 1954 at the age of 44, having spent most of his adult life in obscurity in Texas. Topper Reynolds, the son Libby had carried on that terrible night, grew up wealthy but troubled, much like the father he never knew. In August of 1950, at the age of 17, he died in a climbing accident on Mount Whitney in California. The Reynolds line that began with Smith ended with Topper, 2 generations of young men dead before their time. Libby used the money from Topper's inheritance to establish the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, which supported civil rights causes during the 1950s and 60s. She became a friend and supporter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., transforming the tobacco money into a force for social justice. It was, perhaps, her way of finding redemption, of giving meaning to the tragedy that had defined her life. And what of Ralda House, the mansion that Catherine Reynolds had built as a sanctuary for healthy living, the house where her youngest son had died under circumstances that will never be fully understood? After Smith's death, the estate stood largely vacant for years. The Reynolds family trustees debated whether to sell it or tear it down. The memories were too painful, the maintenance too expensive, the future too uncertain. Reynolda had become, in the words of one family member, a haunted place. But Mary Reynolds Babcock, Smith's older sister, refused to let her mother's dream die. In 1935, she and her husband Charles purchased the estate from the other heirs. They used it as a vacation home at first, returning to Winston-Salem only periodically. But in 1948, they moved permanently to Reynolda, determined to restore it to its former glory. Mary had her mother's vision and her mother's determination. She preserved the house much as Catherine had designed it, maintaining the sleeping porches and the pipe organ, the stainless steel kitchen and the formal gardens. She also began collecting American art, filling the rooms where she had played as a child with works by Georgia O'Keeffe, John Singer Sargent, and other masters. When Charles Babcock died in 1964, the family made a decision that would ensure Reynolda's survival for generations to come. They donated the house and its grounds to the public, transforming it into a museum of American art and a monument to the Reynolds family's complicated legacy. Today, Ralda House stands much as it did when Catherine Reynolds first walked through its doors more than a century ago. The white stucco walls still gleam in the Carolina sunshine. The green tile roof still rises against a backdrop of oak and pine. The gardens still bloom with the flowers that Catherine chose so carefully, tended now by a new generation of caretakers who understand what this place means. Visitors can tour the 64 rooms where the Reynolds children grew up, where R.J. Reynolds spent his final months, where Catherine planned her progressive vision for rural reform. They can see the pipe organ that once filled the house with music, the sleeping porches where the family breathed fresh mountain air, the kitchen with its revolutionary stainless steel surfaces. They can walk the gardens that she designed with such care, see the restored greenhouses that supplied her table, explore the village where her workers once lived in conditions far better than most laborers of that era enjoyed. And they can stand on the sleeping porch, where, on a hot July night in 1932, Smith Reynolds took his last breath. The museum has preserved that space as part of its story, neither hiding the tragedy nor exploiting it. A small exhibit tells the tale of Smith and Libby, displaying artifacts from their brief, doomed marriage. The wallet Smith threw at Ab Walker, fragments of the bullet that killed him, the sheriff's sketches of the crime scene. There is more than one way for a house to be haunted. Reynolda carries its ghosts not as spectral figures drifting through corridors, but as questions that echo through time. What really happened that night? Was it murder, suicide, or tragic accident? Did Libby Holman know more than she ever admitted? Did the Reynolds family's intervention prevent justice or merely spare everyone further pain? The answers may lie buried with those who lived through those events, all of them now gone. What remains is the house itself, standing proud and white against the North Carolina sky, its green tile roof glinting in the sun. It remains a testament to Catherine Reynolds's dream of healthy living and progressive ideals, and a monument to the darker truth that even the greatest fortunes cannot protect us from loss. R.J. Reynolds built a tobacco empire that made him the richest man in North Carolina. Catherine Smith. Reynolds built a house that embodied her hopes for a better world. Their youngest son, Smith, inherited their wealth but not their luck. He died at 20, leaving behind a mystery that has outlived everyone who might have solved it. Ralda House endures. It has outlasted the tobacco empire that built it, outlasted the scandals that nearly destroyed it, outlasted the family whose name it bears. It stands as proof that some dreams are stronger than the dreamers, that buildings can carry memory and meaning long after those who built them have turned to dust. And on quiet summer evenings, when the cicadas sing and the sun sets over Lake Catherine, visitors sometimes pause on the terrace and imagine they can hear echoes of a distant party, of laughter and music and the clink of crystal glasses. They imagine a young man with sad eyes and a famous name, dancing with a dark-haired singer in a room full of light. They imagine, for just a moment, what might have been. Then the moment passes. The shadows lengthen, and Ralda House settles into another night, keeping its secrets, as it has for nearly 100 years.